He's got so much heart. That play took a lot of heart. You just mentioned this, Melissa. This was the way that Gabe Kaplan and co. used to commentate on high stakes poker back in the day. There's this idea of poker requiring a ton of courage. You have to be a lion, not a mouse. You have to be willing to put it all on the line, make a big bluff for your tournament life or for many buy-ins in a cash game, make a big call. Let's talk about heart / courage / fear, maybe even it borders into today, all of these things, and explore the question of what is courage in poker? Well, how did you come up with the idea for this podcast, first of all?
So I was watching an old episode of High Stakes Poker, which is a show I love, by the way. To this day, it's still my favorite kind of poker show ever. But there was Gabe Kaplan, who was the announcer on that show, who I also love. And I think he's really funny and great in that role. But he would always kind of make these comments when someone, like a player, made like a big bluff. And if it got called or it didn't go through, it didn't work, he would always make a comment about, well, so-and-so may have been wrong in that situation, but you know what? They got a lot of heart. You can't fault them for not having the kind of stones to throw their hat in the ring. And I also see this in other places. Really, it's kind of common sometimes on Twitter with players who play on stream. If they lose really big or they have a bad session, they will tweet out something along the lines of like, well, I left it all on the line, or I'd rather die fighting than on my knees, or something like that. And I think it always kind of struck me as an interesting concept for poker players, because when we think about courage, like we have the kind of classical idea of courage, which I think is universal and everyone would kind of understand. And this is the kind of Hollywood filtered version of courage where you stand up to difficulty. You have a choice between giving up, but you continue on. You take a risk in a situation where like the odds don't look good, and that is considered courageous. And that's a story that I think a lot of people like hearing and watching, and it's very much a virtue in our culture. But I don't know if that's what courage really means to me when it comes to poker. In fact, I think that version of courage is a kind of dull representation of courage. It's almost like a carbon copy of what courage really is. It's not the true thing. And by that, I mean that I think courage is often very mundane and very boring, and sometimes may even look like fear. And so what I wanted to talk about today, Pete, was what you think about some of these theories I have regarding courage in poker, and to kind of see where we come out on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. First off, one thing I was talking about on a YouTube video recently, the video was actually entitled, "Do I Have the Courage to Fold These Gross Spots?" I think that was the name of it. Because I actually believe that, like you said, it looking like fear, I really like that. I think sometimes taking the action that doesn't involve the risk, that actually doesn't involve putting the money into the pot, there's a lot of courage to an action like that. Like we talked about a hand recently, I won't go into detail, where you had ace king pre, and in hindsight maybe you could have made like a really big exploitative fold in a pre-flop spot that you wouldn't normally have, and to actually like switch into the mode where one makes a big fold like that takes a special kind of thinking, and it takes the overriding of a very natural barrier or resistance that's trying to protect you from what would normally be deemed as absurdity. So if I make a big fold in a spot, like I fold trips on the flop, like I did in that video, I very rarely fold trips on the flop, I folded trips on the flop in this video, and afterwards I really liked the fold, and I thought, well, I think that's an obvious fold now I think back on it. I think it's clearly better than calling, yet it felt so difficult to do. And there were all these parts of my brain just screaming like, just call here, like you have to call. Students say things like, it was a cooler, is this just a cooler or did I play bad? Or do I just have to put it in here? Sometimes they even say totally irrational things like, I think I'm losing almost always here, but I can't fold. And it's like, well, that's interesting, because if you're losing almost always, you don't have the 33% pot share EV that you need to call, or equity on the river that you need to call. So what is this mysterious force that means that you can't fold? Maybe that mysterious force is actually a lack of courage to be able to do the right thing. So I totally agree with the point that very often folding or something that looks like aversion or something that looks like trying to take a less risky play is actually much more difficult and involves the vaulting over many more and higher mental hurdles than the mundane I got coolered here, trips over trips, woe is me, I have to call does. So that's the first point I would make on it before we talk about anything else.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting. I've seen that video. I like that video, and I really like that concept. I think it's helpful to understand courage can be as a passive action as opposed to an assertive action. I think that's actually like kind of a countercultural statement because we classically associate courage with assertion, not passivity. And I think in poker, passivity can be courage, but it can also be fear as well. I mean, I don't want to put too much emphasis on our point too, but I think recasting it as a courageous action is really interesting. I think too that courage is also the courage to not allow yourself to become, for lack of a better word, a stereotype. So we've talked about this on some of the prior episodes, this idea of something I do, which is kind of a mental exercise, which is when I'm in a tough spot or I'm having a bad session or I've made a mistake and I'm starting to kind of feel myself being dragged into tilt. I'm starting to feel the session start to come off the rails and turn into something that could potentially be bad. This idea of saying, I'm not going to act in this way that is a stereotypical response to this situation. I think that in itself is courageous. I don't think it's the whole, it's not everything though. So being able to say, I'm not going to act, in a way that's going to tilt off more money. I'm not going to be the stereotypical poker player that loses 3 buy-ins right now. That in itself is the mental part of it. But there's also the part of it is, well, the other part of it is the physical part of it. How are you playing? So you could have the mental in your mind saying, I'm not going to allow myself to get dragged down into this terrible situation. But if you're playing in a way that then is more passive than you normally would play, or you're playing in a way where you're not getting it in where you know that you should be getting it in, that's a way where courage can quickly turn into, I guess, for lack of a better word, non-courage. It could easily turn into a situation where you've tricked yourself into thinking you're being courageous. And that's the same exact thing as if you have a really bad session, you lose a lot of money. And instead of going back through the session and thinking, okay, where did I make mistakes? How do I analyze this? How do I learn from the situation? You say, well, at least I took a chance. At least I was courageous. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
I'm kind of trying to connect these two things.
Absolutely. I think sometimes courage is breaking the mold of what's easy to go along with. Courage is like being a leaf that's being blown around in a storm, but you actually fight back against the wind and go the other direction. It's like doing something that's against the laws of physics for your brain to do at that time. It's almost like a physiological shift that requires a huge amount of effort to swim against the current. It's something like that. And I've experienced this a lot recently where restraint has actually felt like really courageous. Like, for example, when a situation gets toxic for you on Twitter, and something like this happened to me like fairly recently, the natural response when you're being attacked or you feel under threat, like something is at stake and it's quite bad and you have to do something about it, the most natural response is lashing out, right? It's like fighting back at people and being like, no, actually, you're a scumbag, blah, 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 blah. And there's times on my stream when there's been a troll in my chat and they've said like, Pete, you're shit, whatever, like you attract this when you're in the public eye. And there have been days where I have been really uncourageous and I have actually just been in a bad mental place where I've not been able to summon the courage to deal with it appropriately, and I have like shouted at the troll and abused them back. And I've done that, I've been there. You don't fucking feel like a hero after you do that, let me tell you, Melissa. You do not feel like a courageous hero when you like fight back venomously against the troll and just become no better than the troll. Like, that's definitely not good. So maybe we have this idea that going along with something in a fighty or flighty kind of manner isn't actually courageous. Maybe I would go as far to say that it can't be courageous, that it's logically inconsistent to call that courageous, because that's what your brain is supposed to do. That's its wiring. Like, when you're under attack and you're backed into a corner and your life depends upon fighting, is it courageous to fight rather than lying down and dying? Or is it just innate and guaranteed that you're going to do that? Okay, if you have the choice between fighting and fleeing, Is one more courageous than the other? It's not clear to me that one is in that situation. And if you're backed into a corner and you have absolutely no choice but to fight, in what sense can it be courageous to do something that evolution has selected you for doing almost necessarily without you having a choice? I'm very much on board with this idea, and I think in poker there are a lot of players who are tilted in some moment, or maybe like long-term just tilted individuals who are always in some form of tilt when they're playing because they have like a bit of a degeneracy issue with the game. And they like to bluff. You have these people like, I'm an action player. Jamie Gold famously said, you'll have seen him on High Stakes Poker, he famously said back in 2006, I want to be the best bluffer in the world. I don't want to be the best player in the world, Daniel. I want to be the best bluffer in the world. Or maybe it was Phil Hellmuth or one of the other 19 Phils that played in that game that he said it to. I don't remember. But yeah, like he said this, and he was just like way over bluffing absolutely every spot. And everybody knew it. And he did really badly in that game, I think. Don't quote me on it, but I think he did. So there are a lot of poker players out there that will like fire off bluffs in spots where they're clearly like minus EV bluffs, or they'll call in spots where it's clearly a bad call. And the fact that they made that bluff, that spew, that call, there's nothing courageous about it. It's purely degenerate. And it would have actually taken more courage to resist the desire to make that mistake that's so natural to them. So when an alcoholic stops drinking or a drug addict stops using, that's courage because it's swimming against the current and it's going up the hill, it's walking the other way on the conveyor belt. That's courage. When you just do what your brain is naturally wired to do and bluff because you're a spewy player that overbluffs every spot, you're just a losing player. You're just a degenerate fish. And saying that you have heart because you fired off a bluff that everyone expects you to make with 8 times more bluffing combos than you have value combos, nothing courageous about it, unfortunate, and probably you should have a different career than poker if you're wired that way.
Yeah. I had a situation last weekend, or this past weekend, I guess, where a player at my table who was I've played with before, but he's very inexperienced, very spewy, just very difficult to play against because he's this kind of combination of a newer player who doesn't understand kind of how his play, he doesn't understand much about anything when it comes to poker, but he's also really spewy. And so we got into this hand and I ended up folding on the river. I ended up folding the best hand and he immediately showed me the bluff. And my reaction at first was like I got really frustrated with myself because I felt like I probably could have called, et cetera, et cetera. But then kind of the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, like I actually behaved quite rationally in that situation based on how he played that hand, betting 3 streets, well, raising my bet on the turn. I mean, just was like completely odd way to play it. With all the information I had, I made the best choice I could at the time. And I honestly, it felt like, this is maybe an extreme example, but like, like never seen this happen in real life, but in movies, there's always this, like, if someone's like standing on the edge of a building and they're like threatening to jump and there's like someone on the ground with a megaphone, like trying to talk them out of doing it. It almost felt like that. It felt like me trying to kind of negotiate with someone that was completely out of their mind and not thinking rationally at all. And in that situation, if a person who maybe they're a police officer and their job is to like, they're called in to kind of talk people off ledges in these situations, and someone jumps in that situation, like I'm sure it's like, it probably feels awful, but like, it's not like the person that like the hostage negotiator or the person on the ground doesn't lose their job because of that. Like, it's not looked at as like a failure. It's looked at as like you behaved in the best way possible in a difficult situation with someone that was behaving completely irrationally. And I think like that is how I felt in that situation. And I ended up, pulling myself out of it and kind of feeling okay about it after I'd given it some thought in the session. And I think when you talk about courage, making that call on the river probably would have been conventionally courageous. It would have been me saying, okay, this person is, clearly close to jumping. I have this textbook of things I can say to them to make them not do it, but I'm going to go off script this one time because it seems like this person, I can do something different and that's going to save them. That, maybe in that moment, it would be courageous to kind of go off script. In my moment in game, it would have been courageous potentially for me to go off script at that last on that river and call, but I didn't. And I think having thought through it, I thought, well, maybe it would have been conventionally courageous to call, but maybe it would have been truly courageous not to. And that's the kind of difference that happens in game and in a session where are you going off of what you consider to be like a conventionally courageous act, or are you doing something that can be courageous, but would not be necessarily recognized as courageous to someone, the general public or our general idea of what courage means.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think it so depends on self-honesty. If you can listen to your like truest self and what that person thinks is right, and you can do that amidst all the emotional noise and the storm that's swirling around your brain, that to me is really courageous. Like being able to listen to logic in times of turmoil, being able to not act upon desires, that kind of thing. But I think also there's a sort of courage which is more conventional, which is being able to avoid idleness, being able to avoid inaction that leads to stagnation, that leads to a lack of progress. So if there's a problem in your life, like let's say the homepage of my website was like kind of bothering me up until recently. It's been bothering me for ages and ages, and every time I look at it, I'd be like, oh, I really need to deal with that. There's some things on there from when it was first made that we've not really like fixed yet and stuff like that. And the other day, I was just like, do you know what? I'm gonna have a call with my assistant. I'm going to get her to fix all these things. I'm going to make a list of it, and I'm going to get this sorted out. And when you actually take action by doing something, this is very Peterson-esque, obviously, right? But when you do something, you like stand up bloody well straight and clean your room, you do that. It's important because you're fixing like that small part, as he would put it, of your castle, of your empire, and like fix your own life before you criticize the world and be outward with your negativity or whatever. But it takes so much courage sometimes just to stand up one day and say, this little part of my fortress is bothering me, I'm going to fix it. Like the biggest example of this, I know I talked about my dad last week on the podcast about the light bulb breaking and him saying fuck and stuff like that. Oh great, now we have to put the explicit warning on Spotify. Silly Pete.
I like that warning though. I like that warning.
Yeah, it's probably for the best. So like he would leave things a lot of the time, not intentionally, but he lacked, I would say, the courage to deal with the fact that there was a hole in the wall that needed fixed for a couple of years or like things like that. And I think when you don't want to do something and you need to, again, swim upstream, this is going to be my metaphor for today of what courage is, both inside and outside of poker. It takes a lot of courage to say, I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call a plasterer. And that's not, no one wants to do that. Nobody wants to find a plasterer, try and like vet them, find one you trust and then get them to fix your wall. Nobody wants to do that. For most people, that's actually a lot more stressful than you would commonly admit. I'm sure the common person wouldn't readily admit to being really stressed by that, but I know a lot of people, including myself, that would find that a really daunting thing to have to do in the middle of their day when they've got other stuff on and things like that. So I think sometimes these minor acts of just like repairing your own little world and looking after yourself require a ton of bravery, whereas letting yourself be out of shape, letting yourself, become obese or something like that, just for an example, or to have like a terrible diet or to become an alcoholic. I think these things are actually really easy and don't require any courage, but to avoid those things, especially if you have a certain proclivity to those things, really does require a lot of courage. So I'm going to say that extends to poker. I'm going to say that courage in poker and in the poker industry is being able to go against the grain, being able to say what you think is right, and being able to actually act on what you think is right during a hand, even though you know that 90% of the community will go, ha ha ha, what a terrible fold. Like I knew when I folded trips on the flop in that video that I would put it out there and lots of people watching it would go, oh, what a stupid fold. And they would use the word too tight. And you'll know on my Discord, we have this list of banned terms that we're not trying to like police what people actually say outside of the Discord, but we're trying to like guide them towards using better language so that they can become better poker players and express what they mean more succinctly and correctly. And some of the banned words we have on there are too tight, too passive, too spewy, etc. Because the idea is that when you deem a play too passive, because it looks like a particularly passive line compared to what you normally see in the poker world, what you're doing is actually lazily and pathetically, I would go that far, pathetically looking up to an arbitrary benchmark and being like, oh no, more passive than is normally accepted. That's too passive. If everybody behaved like that, society would crumble. If you didn't have leader types that had the courage to go against the grain and set new precedents for things, you would never have positive change. You'd never have reform. You would just have a stagnated, corroded society. And maybe what courage also is in poker is being able to say, to hell with these stupid arbitrary benchmarks. It's not too tight to fold trips on the flop if I have 15% equity in true EV terms and I need 30 to make the call. How could that possibly be too tight? So I think being able to go against poker cultural norms when you think you're right about something, that's courage. Making a call with a set because you have a set and most people would call there, that's pathetic, actually.
Yeah, going against poker norms is a really important concept. I'm glad you brought that up. I see it all the time in my game. I think my normal game that I play, which is really just because it's the one that runs the most where I live, is just, it's a 1-2 game with you can buy it. It's a pretty deep buy-in, but the game is 1-2. It plays, I think, more like a 2-5. But one of the things that is a common trait of almost all the players in my pool is limping. I see it so much, and I actually find it depressing. And I find it depressing because I feel like whether you choose to limp is, in my opinion, like how you choose to live your life. Like that is such an indicator in my mind of like how, and I'm not talking about people who limp exploitively or who have come up with a theory of why limping is appropriate in some spots. And I know that in some spots it is okay to limp, but I'm talking about the player type who sits down and just consistently limps from early position, middle position, who you've never seen once raise pre-flop unless it's, you know, a monster hand, tens plus or something like that. And even then, I mean, there's some players that won't do it unless they have queens or better. But I think like that pattern, that process of sitting at a table when you're in late position and you're just watching limp, 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 that is like, in my opinion, like I think it's cowardice. I'll just go ahead and say that. I think the idea of saying I just want to see a cheap flop is something that is very difficult for me to kind of like deal with over and over again, because like I said, I think it's like an indicator of how you live your life, like how you're choosing to spend your time here on earth, how you're choosing to spend your consciousness. I think if you have even a remote interest in getting better at poker, one of the first things you're going to learn is not to limp, that it's plus EV to come into the pot by opening with a raise or taking an assertive action. So when I'm just seeing like all of these limpers, like it's telling me that either these people don't have any interest in even remotely getting better, or they do know that and they do it anyways because it's safer, it's risk aversion, et cetera, et cetera. And I think like the idea of being that player who says, okay, I have 5 limpers behind, I have like a marginally decent opening hand, I'm going to open. Like that in itself is courageous. Being able to say to yourself, you know, when everyone at the table is, you know, like for instance, like one of the things that happens to me a lot is like the way I use sizing. Another common habit in, I think, lower stakes games is opening for like 3x the big blind. Like that's just like people just do that. And they do that because they want to clear the table. They don't want to have more than 1 or 2 callers. They want to see a flop with like the least amount of players possible. And if they get a lot of callers, they'll make some comment of like, oh, wow, well, I guess I didn't get rid of anyone. Or, you know, like here we go to a flop with, you know, 1 million callers. And so like it just perpetuates this idea that if you don't put enough money in the pot pre-flop and you get your aces cracked, you deserved it. You deserve that, you know? And so my sizing is a lot smaller pre for a number of different reasons. Now people know me well enough to know that that's how I play. But when I first started doing that, it was like I had entered into a environment and was, you know, into a tribe and was doing something that was kind of like I was dishonoring a god or something. Like I had like really insulted the tribal elders. People got so upset and accused me of being snobby, a poker snob, thinking I'm better than people, blah, 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 to I don't know what I'm doing, and to re-raising me, which sometimes, you know, resulted in even more money going to the pot when I put in another bet, or when or they realized I didn't get him anywhere when I just folded or something like that. It was this response of, what is this person doing? And we don't like it. And I think that is maybe not a surprise to anyone who's maybe played and come up through lower stakes before you get to higher stakes. You've encountered this, but really for me, that kind of behavior is to me very cowardly, and I'll just come out and say it. And I think like if you're listening to this and you're one of these players and like you're recognizing, I doubt anyone is listening to this and is like a player type that just limps all the time and would, you know, react with hostility towards someone opening, you know, 2x instead of 3x. But if you are, just know that I think you're cowardly. So
this is hilarious. I love this.
It only took 6 episodes for me to insult people listening, so that's pretty good.
Do you know what I think's cowardly? The regs that are sat here going, oh no, don't scare off the weaker players, Melissa. You're being nasty to our weaker players, and I'm going to lose my EV and my soft spot because you're insulting them. That's even more cowardly than the people you're insulting. But yeah, I love this. Like Melissa goes on a tirade against like the fish in the game for something that's really not even, they're not even doing consciously. Just like, by the way, you're all cowards for playing badly at poker. I love it. We need more of that. We need less people being like, protect the fish. Let's join the game and be super respectful to this guy and be really nice and buy him dinner. It's like, that guy is like a fucking successful businessman that earns like 12 times what you make every year and knows exactly what you're doing, and you're sitting there being like, oh, let's be lovely to this guy and be super false. And I just can't stand all of that sleazy grooming of the weaker player. I think it's like repulsive. So I really hope you've at least defended the regs that want to like sleazily and insincerely groom the weaker players there.
I mean, I don't care. And I also, too, I feel like I'm not going to be false in anything I do, and I'm not going to be dishonest. I mean, I'm not going to go out of my way to make someone feel uncomfortable at the table or get them to leave or something like that. I mean, but, you know, in this forum, in this conversation, I'm going to be honest. I think, like, if there's one thing people will, you know, can trust about me is that I'm not going to pull punches. And like, I'm so bored by people who are fake, and I'm so bored by a kind of false modesty or a false, you know, this kind of like, I'm going to trick you into playing longer than you normally would play because I'm being nice to you. Like you said, it's so bad, especially when it's someone who's really successful outside of poker. Like if you're like outside of poker and other industries, like the amount of social skills you have to get to the top of, I'm not even talking about the top of any kind of industry. I'm talking about just like a mid-level successful person in an industry. Like you have to have social skills that are about 10x what the normal person maybe has. Like you have to be able to negotiate multiple different types of personalities. You have to be able to control your emotions in all different types of spots. Like, and then like sitting down at a poker table and having some grinder be like, oh, that was a really good call. Like, it's too bad. Sorry. It's like, it's like, don't insult people. If you're going to spend your life doing something and devoting yourself to something, have that be honest and true. Don't be part of like this wider problem we have in society where people are fake. Every time you're fake, like you die a little bit, and then eventually you get to the point where you've died so much that you don't even remember who you were.
Yes.
So good luck with that. Maybe your bankroll will be big because you have, you know, you've been able to play with fish for so long and you've been false. But I don't know, your soul will be black. Anyways.
Yeah, it's already episode 6, and we're calling people, saying people have black souls. Yeah, this has gone well. This podcast. What's that? 84 views on. Yeah, this is great. 84 YouTube views.
Yes.
All our views are on Spotify. Melissa, don't worry, they can't see you there, so they can't associate your black soul rhetoric with what you actually look like. So it's fine.
Honestly, like this is not a new thing for me. Like I've had this conversation with people that like friends of mine and everything. Some of the people I play seriously with, and they love it, and everyone kind of agrees. And I also will say, like, if you are the kind of person who feels like their game is like sitting there and being nice to fish and encouraging this kind of stuff, and I mean, great, don't stop doing it on my account. Why do you care what I think? I'm just saying that from my perspective, that's not how I play. I want to be very clear. I'm not mean to people. I'm not cruel to people. I think I'm actually pretty fun to play with, but I'm just not fake. But I do think, like, from my perspective, there is a certain kind of cowardice in being false. That's not to say it's black and white. There's a lot of degrees of what constitutes like being false, being true. But like last episode, we talked about kind of the hierarchy of values that we bring to the poker table. And like, we have to create our own hierarchy of values in the poker world because God is dead. For me personally, like the top of my hierarchy is, I mean, maybe it sounds pretentious, but it's truth. That's really what it is. And it's like, if I'm not behaving true, like I've violated like the highest point on my hierarchy, and like I won't be able to sleep that night, and I will feel like I've done something that has gone absolutely in the opposite direction of who I am, like to the very fiber of my being, and like I'm just not okay with that. Now, in terms of like telling the truth in a situation where someone says, oh, what did you have there, or you know, like a question, like a more direct question like that, I generally just like, I won't tell them. Every once in a while, like if someone asks me something specifically and it's like a very specific question, I won't be dishonest, but I'll say something like, you know, you were good there or you weren't good there if I feel like there's certain EV advantages in that. But it's not to the level where I'm going to basically, you know, tell someone that I think is like a terrible player, like, oh, like you were really good there. Like you're a really good player. It's a shame that this is happening to you. Mm-hmm. So anyways, yeah, probably already said too much.
No, not at all. I love it. I love that as the podcast goes on, we're going to get more and more of this real you coming out, because we've known each other for quite a while before Through coaching mainly, but also we have a lot of chats and stuff as friends, and we've known each other before we started recording the podcast. And this is one of the things I like about you the most, is that you're just extremely honest and direct and truthful about everything. And you're right that when people are dishonest, it eats away at every fiber of them. It just like creates this paper mache villainous part of them that they've created and now have to maintain. Because the thing is that when you start lying, you actually create a network of little horrible snake demons, little mini snake demons in a nest that you then have to feed. And you have to feed them every day till they grow up into like actual vipers, and then they're a part of you, and you have all these vipers inside you that you have to like nurture. And to nurture a false version of yourself that you've created is one of the worst things like ever. I've been there. I've lived my life in ways like I've told you about when I was younger and I was much more egotistically hedonistic and short-term gratification seeking. I've told you about like where that comes from, like a bit about what my childhood was like and like how I sort of spent adult life slowly but surely moving away from that towards a place of truth. And, you know, the most content I've been in all of my life has been in the last like 5 years, where I've really like fully successfully entered the final stages of that transition, where I don't lie about anything. I don't have anything to lie about. I don't conduct myself in a way where I do have things to lie about. That's another problem. If you live your life in a way where you actually have to lie just to like make your behavior seem acceptable to the world or to yourself or to some significant other, that's a wretched place to be. But to bring this back to poker, yeah, I think there's a ton of dishonesty like in the poker world. That's a real example of a lack of bravery. I think the poker players are dishonest with themselves all the time. I think they're unwilling to accept their true level. Sometimes in sessions, a student will say, oh, yeah, no, but I was thinking that. Like, we'll have a conversation and I'll be like, right, so what are your thoughts in this spot? They'll give me their thoughts. Then I'll be like, but you've missed this really important part of the puzzle. This is really big, this leak that you have in your game. And they'll respond by being like, oh, yeah, no, I thought that. I was like, well, you didn't, because if you understood that or thought that, there's no way you would have taken that line. Like, you just can't. At that point, you might be aware of that idea. You might know what I'm saying makes sense, and you might like believe me, and it might resonate with you now, but that doesn't mean you actually thought it in a logical enough way to access that thought pattern yourself. So poker players are really dishonest with themselves, in that when they get coached or they watch content or something like that, they'll go, oh yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Now I understand that. Now I have this cool little weapon to add to my inventory of poker tools, and now I'm like a good player because of it. What they don't take accountability for is that they're not accessing any of those concepts in a way that allows them to play them in game, and they're not integrating them properly into their neural web of poker connections. And in order to actually get good at poker, what you have to do is know where you are. You have to be able to sit down and be like, I know my current level. I know what my in-game thought process sounds like and looks like, and it's bad. And I've had students that actually come to me and say, my thought process is a mess. I've taken so many courses, I've watched so much content on Twitch, YouTube, and it's a mess, and I can't think. And I'll say, okay, talk me through this spot, and they'll give me 9 random thoughts. And the first step for those people is to say, I am a mess. My thought process sucks, and it's overloaded with shit. And once they accept that, we can be like, great, let's start stripping that shit away. Is that bullshit? Yes, okay, in the bin. What about this thought? Oh yeah, that doesn't seem very good now I think about it. Cool, I agree. Shall we shred that up together? Yeah, cool. Sometimes I'd even hold up my trash can when it was presentable and didn't have like banana skins coming out the top of it and show it to the student, and would drop the thought process, you know, metaphorically into the trash. But sometimes there are students who, this is a hell of a segue, I don't know how I got into this, but sometimes there are students who will hold on to their bad thought processes. And they'll be like, no, but. See, when a student says no, but to me, Melissa, I just want to like slap them. I just want to be like, I'm taking your money here. I will take it anyway because you've given it to me for a transaction of coaching. But I'm really irked and disturbed by the fact that I can't help you because of your attitude. An attitude of self-dishonesty and not being transparent to yourself as to what your level is in coaching, it's totally fatal. Unfortunately, now that my rates are a bit higher, I'm a more experienced coach, I've got a better reputation than being a sort of unknown person like I was maybe 10 years ago when I first started. I don't attract as many of the people that are super dishonest with themselves. But maybe I can tell a story now, just like on this note, that I've told many times to many people, and probably like the long-term audience of mine will know this story and they'll be like, Pete, for God's sake, we don't need to hear about the I can't take it guy. But I literally coached a guy about 8 years ago or something when I first started who said, don't tell me I'm bad. I can't take it. I won't take it if you tell me I'm bad. And I was like, well, that's a strange attitude to have when you come to someone for tuition. And that's the extreme of that spectrum. This guy is a caricature. He's on an extreme of the spectrum. A guy that will not take any feedback whatsoever, yet has hired a coach. And I know there's almost no one out there like that, but there are so many poker players that are dishonest with themselves every day who will not accept how bad the bad thoughts are in their game and will not do anything about it. You're lucky, Melissa. You're very lucky. I've told you this before, that your exposure to bad poker thoughts, while there has been some by your own admission, it's not lots. You weren't in poker for like 10 years before you got coached or anything like that. So you don't have half the bad habits that a lot of people have. And not being honest about which thoughts in your game need to be thrown out completely, massive roadblock, holds you back. And it's cowardice because you're clinging on to coping mechanism thought processes that aren't helping you. Binning, trashing a thought process that you have been relying on, realizing that you don't need your walking stick or your Zimmer frame anymore and actually walking independently, that takes courage. Relying on your old thought processes that haven't been helping you for your whole career, that's a lack of courage.
Yeah, I think that the courage to understand where you're at is absolutely important. But I also feel like it's also courageous to admit that you don't know where you're at. And I'm not talking about like globally or this is where how I am compared to other players, but like this is how I am in a session right now. So quick story, I played last night and I think I'm still processing it, but I'm pretty sure last night was the worst session I've played in 2023. Not just because of how I ran, but purely the decisions I've made, how I played. I think I just objectively played worse last night than I have all year. I mean, we're not in December, so that's good. But I feel like the way I played was just awful. And I realized that in game. And it was such a difficult session that I remember thinking near the end of the session before I left that I was completely lost. I lost connection with my own sense of my own skills and my own knowledge of the game. I felt completely untethered. I felt like I had been attached to a spaceship and someone had just like cut the cord and I was just floating in space. And the other players at the table were just generally like the kinds of players that I love to play with, in the sense that they are a lot of action. And generally, I just feel like I have an edge on them. I got to the point last night where I was questioning whether I really did, which is an absurd thing. Now, in the cold light of day, I realize that's an absurd kind of issue. But for a number of different reasons, that's kind of where I was at. And I think that this theme of courage, when I was driving home from the poker room last night, I was thinking like, okay, like what's the courageous way to respond to what just happened? And honestly, at that moment, it felt like the most courageous thing was to just like say like, I don't care. It wasn't me saying, I don't care, whatever, I'm going to become a gambler, I'm just going to be spewy and da-da-da-da. It was, I have to sleep tonight. I have to be able to like function tomorrow. I have to record a podcast in the morning, and then I have to go to my job, and I need to be functional, and I can't lay awake all night worrying about all of this and what it portends for my future, and whether it means that I've taken 3 steps forward with my poker progress and 10 steps backwards, and all of these other terrible thoughts that were kind of creeping up on me. And so at that time, I remember thinking this, like when I was in my car, it was like, I'm going to tell my brain that I just don't care. I don't care about what happened. I don't care about the money I lost. I don't care. That was helpful. And I came home and I just like totally just, before I went to bed, I didn't consume any poker content. I just literally just was like, that's it. And I feel better this morning. And I think that when you talk about knowing where you're at, the courage to know where you're at, there's a lot to that statement. And so I got to the point in that session where I didn't know where I was at. And in order to kind of deal with that, I had to, number one, leave the session, physically remove myself from that situation. And number two, I had to basically tell myself, I don't care where I'm at. I don't care what just happened. I don't care about anything related to poker. And that's all there is to it. I'm not going to say that was a good session, bad session, terrible, whatever. I just don't care. And I think like that seems to have worked at the time. And I think like to bring this back to our theme today, maybe the cowardly thing to do would have been to stay up all night, tossing and turning, beating myself up, saying, how silly, is this whole, how stupid are you? How dumb is this? You made all these mistakes. Like, yeah, the variance, you're running bad variance wise, but you're making it 10 times worse. And this is only going to continue. And you're going to watch your bankroll evaporate and all of these things. I think that would have been easy, and it would have been cowardly.
Yep. It's amazing how sometimes the easiest things for us to do are the most self-destructive things imaginable. I'll give you a story that's like exactly like this. Like that, you have no idea how hard that resonated with me there, what you just said earlier today. And this is one story of very many in like my daily struggles with my own brain that this happened. This thing here, there's no sensitive data on this, is there? No. So this is a card reader for anyone that's not watching on YouTube. It's like something you put your bank card into for your business account. You plug in a little number and you can like access your online banking. And I had a couple of like bank related things to do this morning that I wanted to take care of before my 9 o'clock session. And my student was like getting ready for the 9 o'clock session. It was like 10 to 9 or something. And I couldn't find this. The irony was it was literally just on my desk. Like sometimes I just can't find things that are just like right there. It's like really ridiculous. And I had two choices. I could like rush around and still try to find it and freak out about where it was and be late for the session, or possibly be rushed for the session. Or I could have said, I don't care. I'll find it later. It's no big deal. I lacked the courage to do the latter. I knew it was right for me to do the latter, but for some reason, my brain is so obsessive with certain things. If I say I need to get this job done, like just before my session, I've set aside a little bit of time to do it. It's like a really weird type of OCD I have. I don't have OCD in general. I'm not obsessive compulsive about very many behaviors or anything like that. But when I have lost an object, I cannot sit still. I cannot like be at peace until I find said object. And yeah, I just like went around looking under the sofa and I knew it was time for my session. And I was like disgusted with myself as I was doing it. I was like, this is actually revoltingly cowardly behavior, but I can't help it. And a similar thing happens sometimes when it's like, I've picked up my phone and I could really enjoy the moment here where I'm reading a book and I'm liking the book. And it would be very cowardly. This is going to sound absurd. It'd be very cowardly to like check my YouTube video views or look at WhatsApp, but I do it anyway. And then a part of my brain is like dying. There's a part of my soul that's like blackening in your words, you know, that's actually like turning to molded tar because I have decided to do this really unfulfilling, shallow, depraved act of like looking at some number of validation number on an app. And I know that's what it is. It's a validation number. And I know the dopamine circuit in my head that it's appealing to. And I've done that instead of just having a wholesome experience with my book. I could have just had a wholesome experience, but I've done that. So again, your story, my story, not really equal. I think your story is incredible. I think like when you've just gone through such a traumatic thing as losing sight of your poker self, I've been there. Not recently, maybe semi-recently, but not as much recently as in the past. But I have been in a place where, for whatever reason, you become untethered, as you said, and you just become like unable to access your normal webs, your normal foundational or cohesive webs of ideas. You just can't access them for whatever reason, and you're like a child again. You're like a poker child again with no idea how to make sense of the world. And to go through that and then not try to process it. What you're actually saying to me, Melissa, is that you wanted to process it in an unhealthy way consciously, and your conscious mind was like, deal with this now, process it now at all costs. You have to turn it over and over and cook it to the point where it's been obliterated, and you've obliterated yourself in doing so. It's like a cooker that like breaks whenever you cook something in it. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna obliterate my brain so much with this thing that both of them are dead. It's like some kind of like destruction of the self and the thing that's the problem. And it's like, well, you had the absolute tenacity to say, no, I'm going to act as if I don't care, even though I know I do. This isn't you throwing the toys out the pram and being like, wow, woe is me, I don't care anymore. It's not like you went home and did a bunch of drugs because you were that unable to cope with it. You just were able to go to sleep. And I don't know how you did that. I'm actually quite shocked and impressed that you did that, because I couldn't even stop looking for a fucking card reader 4 minutes before a session today. So what gives? What's the secret?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't think of it as a secret. I think of it as like, it felt like it was the only answer to, it was the only option available. It was like, I could choose to suffer, I could choose not to suffer. And sometimes it's that black and white. And I think being able to kind of honestly say, what is the path that's going to increase my suffering, and what is the path that's going to decrease my suffering? Sometimes that choice is not clear at all. And I think it's very difficult often to know which path we're heading down. But sometimes the choice is really stark. And I would even go so far as to say, the more extreme your suffering, possibly the more clear the choice is. And it just felt to me very clear. It felt like a spot where I was not indifferent. It felt like this is clearly a spot where like I can make one choice that will lead to this result and one choice that will lead to that result. And that's what I did. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I guess at the time I didn't think of it as requiring like a ton of effort. I mean, it did require a lot of effort. It did require me to turn off my phone. I didn't just like go home and go right to bed. I mean, it did other things not related to poker. Yeah, that's just kind of what happened. But I haven't really processed it, to be honest with you. It just happened a couple hours ago. So I'm still kind of coming out of it. And it's kind of not organically just arose in our conversation as something that I thought would be like worth talking about. But it wasn't like I was like, oh, this will be good to talk about tomorrow on the podcast.
I know.
So, no, I know. I'm just kidding. But
I mean, if you're secretly like a huge narcissist, like we used to joke when I first met you because you're quite self-assured that you're like a big narcissist and a psychopath and blah, blah, blah. I know that you're not now, but if you are and you've like pulled the wool over my eyes, then you're incredibly good at it. I'll say that. So I know that's not contrived.
No,
that's why I'm impressed with it. Like, I know it's not contrived, but
No.
it did get me thinking, like, I think the main area where I lack bravery in my own life and in my own career is not like dealing with a crisis. Like when it's a crisis, I will generally just know what I have to do and I will not be afraid of anybody or anything, and I will like try and resolve situations that need resolving, both at work and in life. But where I absolutely lack courage is putting myself through the blender when I don't have to, over trivial things, or maybe untrivial things, but over things where it's not the best way to manage them, to freak out about them or self-destruct over them, yet that's the most natural swimming with the current, swimming downstream kind of way of reacting. And I think to bring it back to poker one final time, which gets harder and harder as this conversation progresses, but I think the idea is that when you are in a session that's going badly for you, or you're on a week that's going badly for you, or a month that's going badly for you, you will have a fight or flight response to that that's really natural for you to do. So you will either run away from poker and take a big hiatus for a few weeks, which is like really bad, actually. It's very bad for your game. It's very bad because you're teaching yourself that you actually can't handle poker, that every time poker starts beating you up, that the right response is to cower in the corner or just run away and close the door and not look at it for a while. And sometimes we do need a break. Sometimes we need a few days off, or we plan a holiday, a vacation or whatever, and that's healthy and that's good. But when your breaks are completely determined by what poker is doing to you and your breaks are long, you're not going to make it. I'm really sorry, but you're not going to make it in this game. This game is really tough. It's really arduous. You're just not going to make it with that attitude. And a lot of the time there, if you were able to fight against the current of your flight mechanism, you would have been able to study the next day. Maybe like 2 days after that horrible run, you'd be able to sit down and review the hands with your coach. You'd be able to go into Pile Solver and do some drills. You'd be able to recharge your inspiration and remember why you're in this game or something like that. And I'm sure you're going to do those things over the next couple of days because I know what you're like as a student and as a player. So you're going to do that, and that's great. When it comes to the other response, which is the tilted self-destruction, some students will busto their bankroll. They'll move up in stakes and punt. They will play blackjack or something. They will like go into a student actually, like I've heard stories of to the effect of, when I run bad, I actually like eat like shit, or I drink too much, or I do something that's like really self-destructive. You hear this as well. And that's like the sort of inner combustion fight tilt. And there it would take courage to just calm down and chill out and not do that. It would take real courage when I feel like going on a drunken bender or buying a pack of cigarettes to cope with some bad news and revert back to being a smoker again or something like that. That's the easiest thing to do. Going to the shop and buying the cigarettes and lighting up the cigarette and being like, oh my God, I'm so unfortunate. I can't believe I have to deal with this thing. And having a cigarette and like starting a habit again that's really bad for me, or like going and getting wasted drunk to like try and deal with it or something. That's the least courageous thing ever. Sitting with it, sober, in the cold light of day, and being like, I will process this in my own time, and I will expose myself to this as and when I'm rested and I'm ready, and I will deal with it in a healthy, balanced, measured way. That's courage. Going and getting wasted and crying about it is not fucking courage. It's like the worst way of dealing with anything. So sometimes courage in poker and in life, I think, is just very much about having the restraint and the patience to not jump in the most automatic fight or flight driven way that's actually going to make things worse. Maybe having courage is very linked to looking after yourself. Maybe it takes courage to truly look after yourself as well in the long term.
It does. And I think the key is having that healthy response. So that healthy response is not always the same response every time. So I think there are times where if you have a really tough session or you're going through some difficulty, it does feel good to, come home and say, I'm going to have some, I'm assuming there's no eating disorders involved, but I'm going to have some ice cream, or I'm going to treat myself to something that I normally wouldn't treat, just to kind of like this kind of self-care. I think we live in a culture where we completely put too much emphasis on self-care. And I actually hate that word. I think it's just so bad, but I'm using it here just because it's simple. But then there's other times where no, the opposite is, you do have to sit with it, and you do have to kind of, be sober and soberly analyze what happened. And, the courage comes into, I think, being flexible, not being rigid, not saying my response is the response that I saw, someone tell me to take, like on my Instagram feed, right? Like I've always constantly see these things about like being resilient, and these videos come up, and I think some of it's because of the content I watch, but I think some of it's because I have a lot of poker content, and like there's algorithms that know that these kinds of videos sell for people like me. But there's a lot of influencers and people who are constantly telling us how to respond to difficulty. Like, this is what you have to do. This is how you have to get back at it, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's very difficult in our current kind of media saturated climate, and just like how we're always on our phones. And I'm certainly guilty of this too, but it's very difficult sometimes to have a genuine response to something. It's difficult to say, I'm responding to this in a way that is my response. It's not a response that someone has told me to respond to it. It's not a response that I've seen reflected in a YouTube video or some influencer's vlog or something. It's my response, and it's something I have control over, and it's me, and there's only one person like me in the world, and it's unique, and it's special, and it's mine. And I think like that kind of understanding is really important to me. And I would say it's actually probably very high on my hierarchy of values. Like when I say truth, being genuine, like that's why it's so important, because I think there's so many things every day that are telling us how to be, instructing us how to live, instructing us how to feel, instructing us how to react, telling us what's important, telling us what's not important. And I hate all of it. I really do. And I think that I'm like a big proponent of recognizing who you are and responding to things genuinely in your own way. Sometimes that's going to be messy. Sometimes you're going to say things that maybe you regret saying. Sometimes you're going to act in ways that you regret, but you're going to learn from those things, and you're going to grow. And any kind of growth requires suffering, and it requires pain. And this idea that you're going to somehow shield yourself from that by acting in a way that some influencer told you to act, or that acting in a way that some video about how to deal with tilt has told you to act, is, I think, silly. Those can be guideposts, but ultimately it's your reaction, it's your life. And I think taking that control of it and making it your own is really affirming and really powerful. And I think like the essence of being a kind of genuine person in a really fake world.
Yeah, so we can probably say that authenticity and bravery are actually joined at the hip. They kind of just are inseparable in a lot of ways, whereas sheep-like behavior, like following the blind preachings of someone, is the opposite of bravery. It's absolute cowardice. I think that poker teachers out there who teach in a way where they're saying, I know secrets. I have the secrets, and you are the person that's going to not know what's going on. You're a headless chicken, and I'm going to give you a box of secrets. And upon opening my magic box of secrets, you're going to suddenly crush. I hate the word crush. Poker has ruined the word crush for me. I can't even like say, oh, I'm going to crush this can without feeling bad now, because poker's ruined the word. Why does everyone have to crush? Why do we have to crush? Can't we just like play well and like do ourselves proud and make money and be a success and beat the opponents? Do we have to crush everything? I'm so sick of it, but that's a side point.
That's interesting.
We'll talk about crush. We'll have a whole episode about crush one day. It's my new banned word. No one's allowed to crush, right? No, but that's too far. We all want the crush, of course. But the point is that if you are consuming the kind of content that doesn't show you how to think, then you're actually copying, you're doing what other people do. It's really unauthentic. Whereas if you're learning how to think from a coach or mentor, or from a training course or something like that, it's you that's doing the thinking. So it's like, if I teach you how to think about poker and you go off and think about poker in that way, you're using a set of skills, but it's your own thoughts that you're using within that framework. Whereas if I say, bet here, always check this spot, and I give you like a big playbook, like a lot of coaching for profit stables do. Here's the playbook. You're now a guinea pig. Go off and execute these 20 things, and you will make some money for us at 25 NL, but you won't be a fucking poker player. No, not at all. You will actually just be a robotic sheep. You'll be there in the 25 NL pool, like, betting, calling. That was a genuine sheep impression. I didn't get my editor to do that, by the way.
It's good.
I do have goats, so that kind of helps. But yeah, like, that's what you're doing. It's really, really bad. And you'll never become a poker player that way. So if you think poker's about unlocking a magic box of secrets or copying a bunch of rules from a playbook, you're going to fail. You might get a little bit. You might like start beating the game you're playing, and you might move up once in stakes or something like that. but you're not going to become a good poker player. That's not what good poker players do. Good poker players are problem solvers. It takes me back to like school. I've got a particular kid in mind who I've not seen since he was a kid, so he's still a kid in my head. He's very good at memorizing things. He was very, very good at like getting good marks on the knowledge and understanding side of a test, but not the problem solving side of the test, if that makes sense. So like very good at like the rote memorization, but couldn't like think freely. And that in poker is fatal. When you are actually like rocking up to the tables with a list of 20 exploits that you learned. Let me just be clear, my course Cash Injection, we do teach you 10 exploits, but we show you with a solver, with node locking, like exactly why they work, so you can actually come to understand the framework behind why they work. So I think that this is cowardice, trying to get quick answers and trying to have sort of roadmaps of what buttons to press. You may as well at that point be a crank arm with like some kind of instruction like move your hand forward 15 centimeters. Place hand down on mouse and move to bet button when 7 of clubs, 4 of clubs, 3 of diamonds is present on screen in X location. You're basically programming yourself like a fucking robot, so no wonder you don't become a good poker player. Copying, looking for secrets, looking for shortcuts, using playbooks, using mass data in a brainless way where you're just rote exploiting the same thing over and over again, it'll get you a certain amount of the way there maybe, but it's cowardice. It's not brave. Bravery is actually saying, I'm going to wrap my brain around this really thorny, horrible, prickly game with all of its intricacies and traps and monsters waiting in cupboards for me. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to enjoy it, and I'm going to, like, face up to that task. That's how I would see bravery and cowardice from a coaching or learning perspective.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. I'll just kind of end on this point because we're going a little bit long here, but I wanted to, this made me think of this one last point that I wanted to mention because it's my own, you mentioned your own cowardice when it comes to kind of obsessing and internally criticizing yourself and things like that. I think one of my biggest areas of cowardice is a lack of patience. So I think it takes courage and bravery to be patient, to allow yourself to take the time to learn and to develop and to not want immediate positive results. So for me, I constantly struggle with the idea of seeing poker as, you know, a much larger, a lifetime activity. And so like, I'm the kind of person that's like, I should be playing higher stakes. I should be doing better. I should be, you know, these are kind of the voices in my head. I don't want to have to wait. I have like a really, sometimes I've had really difficult times when I've been card dead, you know, not overplaying hands that, you know, I shouldn't be doing, not getting into spots that are completely just like unforced mistakes based on a lack of patience. So I think for me, at least, I would say my biggest probably leak when it comes to this idea of cowardice and courage is a lack of patience, because I'm just not a naturally patient person. I'm not patient with processes that I feel like need to take time. And even if I recognize it needs to take time, even if I recognize I'm being foolish by being impatient, it's very, very difficult for me to kind of not feel that way. So sometimes the difficulty I have with sessions is not necessarily what happened, but that things that didn't happen or things that I felt like should have happened didn't happen, or that things didn't happen fast enough. I'll quickly end with this example, but I had a session a couple days ago where I was stuck really just like one buy in the whole session, and I just couldn't move. I wasn't moving up or down from this position. And I finally got to the point where like I was basically even, and it was really late, and I knew I needed to leave, and I did leave. But I remember thinking to myself, gosh, like I just wish I had more time. I never have enough time. I started getting really kind of flustered and stressed out about my schedule and juggling kind of work and playing. And I just was kind of working myself up into this, you know, kind of mess over like not having enough time in the day. And gosh, I just wish I didn't have to sleep and all of these things. And that is an example of like, I think that was kind of a cowardly response. I think the more courageous response would have been like, the session's over, the day's over, you'll be able to play again. That is not something I was able to do in that moment. But I think identifying this for me as like an area of fear is helpful.
Yeah, I think we're very similar in that respect. I really struggle with the concept of the end of the day sometimes. Like I used to struggle with the concept of the evening. Like if I don't have a really good computer game that I'm enjoying making progress at, and it has to be a competitive game to play, because I don't play poker in the evening or anything like that. I don't do anything poker related in the evening. Or if I don't have like a some hobby that really challenges me to be better and do better. Like I play a lot of bridge, as I've mentioned to you before. I really struggle with the idea of not doing anything. Like if I watch like 2 episodes of a Netflix show, I feel like corrupted inside. Like that time I spent not trying to battle people or achieve things is wasted in some way. And I think it's just my personality type. Like I think you're similar to me in that we're very competitive people that need to be constantly like challenging ourselves all the time. And when you can't do that anymore because like your body tells you it's time to sleep and your life tells you it's time to work, and you know you have certain like obligations you have to take care of, yeah, it's really infuriating and it's really difficult to sit with. And I think it comes back to the whole can't find the card reader thing for the online banking. It's the same thing where it's like, I need to solve the problem now. I can't sit with it being unsolved for an hour because that's too long for me to sit knowing there's a problem awaiting me. I very much have that problem as well, where I lack bravery and not being able to postpone things or take a long-term view or see the bigger picture. And I don't know what we really do about that, but hey, let's work on it. Let's talk about it together, and maybe one day I'll stop freaking out over like losing an object for 5 minutes and spend like the whole day stressing about it. And maybe one day you'll be able to sit there card dead and be at peace, like fully, even though you're not getting a single hand and you're down a buy-in. That's an infuriating situation, by the way, for anybody that plays live. They'll be able to relate to that. Right, we better wrap this up because I have another call I have to get onto with my tech guy. I could talk about this subject. It was a great topic, Melissa. I could talk about this a lot longer, but yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, I agree. It was a great topic. I enjoyed this. I just want to say, like, we had last week, I think we had in our Discord a pretty nice, robust conversation about the ethics, our episode on the ethics of poker. I just want to let everyone know I really enjoyed reading that and learning about other people's perspectives on this question. I think it's a really interesting question. And I think, speaking for myself, like, it's really useful and affirming for me to see like people talking about like themes that we discuss here and kind of expanding that conversation. One of the things that I think is difficult sometimes about the poker community is it can feel like people are constantly sniping at each other or trying to one up another or behaving in ways toward each other that are, you know, kind of ugly. And so it's really refreshing and helpful to know that I think this podcast and certainly our Discord community and the people that are listening and have left really nice comments are the opposite of that. So contributing to kind of good things and contributing to kind of like the fun side of poker, in my opinion, which is the pursuit of like the logic of poker and the beauty of the game and the beauty of not only of the game, but what it teaches us and what we learn from it about how we treat other people.
Couldn't agree more. I think our community is a great place. I think it self-selects. I think, like, as you said earlier, like I don't think you said this while we were recording, but you said something like what you project comes back to you. So if you project like an open, explorative, curious attitude to your teaching, you're going to get people in your community that are like that. I think that's what we've done over the last few years, and I'm super grateful that we have everybody in that community. I think they're all amazing, and they are so it's about having a like-minded tribe that you can identify with, and that's certainly what we've done. I agree that the greater pokersphere is a pretty toxic, immature, and unpleasant place. Let's talk about that in a podcast soon. Guys, you know what to do. If you like our podcast, do like it on YouTube. Do leave us a little review or rating on Spotify. We really appreciate it. And it's carrotcorner.com for everything else from me. We'll see you next time on Poker Distilled.